All right, I was really looking forward to hearing Pat's story about when we met in 2002 in Seattle, since it would have been new to everyone except for Pat. It's also funny that Pat is looking forward to hearing my talk based on what I told him about it, because I think when I told him about it, I didn't actually know what I was going to talk about. And to some extent, I don't now, and that's why I don't have any slide, because I don't want to be locked into some rigid set of nothingness, an empty slide. So this is actually my slide. Yeah, thanks. This is the timer, I suppose. Yeah, so let's turn the lights on and wake up. I've been doing Ruby programming since about as long as most people who speak English. That would be year 2000. Not all people who speak English, but most people who speak English. I've been, since 2001, co-organizing the International Ruby Conference. Now we're going to all fall asleep. Turn them on. That's good. So I've been co-organizing the International Ruby Conference since 2001, which is why Pat thought we met at the Ruby Conference in 2002. But in 2002, I was in India. Actually, I was in Hungary, but I was living in India. It's a long, complex, sordid story, but that was the one Ruby conference that I missed. So even though I've been organizing them since the beginning, when we have the conferences and we always ask people, raise your hand if you've been to all of them, I've not raised my hand since the first one, unfortunately. But I come from an enterprise Java background, sort of Perl before that. Before that, I was a musician. So I sort of just locked into this software development world, which means I can't really teach most of you anything, the whole implementers panel and that sort of stuff. I don't know how to do that kind of thing. I wish I did. It would be really exciting to be able to implement my own Ruby VM. And instead, I can just sort of sit next to them and say, well, how would I add a method to array for you? And then get frustrated as I try. I can't really do that. I dropped out of music school so I could be a programmer. I was a classical composer, and I sort of saw Doom as a natural direction to go after that. So I started playing a lot of Doom, and that led to the IT industry. And here I am. So I sort of come to this conference with two perspectives to attempt to share. I'm not going to really teach you how to do anything. I'm really just going to raise a bunch of questions and tell you about some things that scare me, because I feel like I am at a dangerous crossroads in my own career. And we as a community are at dangerous crossroads as well. And we need to act appropriately now to avoid failure. So the two perspectives that I have are, one, I'm a Ruby programmer. I'm part of Ruby Central Incorporated, which is the equivalent to, say, the Perl Foundation or the Apache Foundation for Ruby, started by David Black, Dave Thomas, and myself in 2001, primarily to be the driving force behind the Ruby conferences, but we're slowly expanding our scope, trying to help do things like foster conferences such as this, the Google Summer of Code, sponsorship, that sort of thing, and drive advocacy and acceptance of the Ruby language. So I've been kind of involved in the Ruby community since before I could write a decent Ruby program. That's the way that I've chosen to contribute in most cases. The other perspective is, I mentioned that I lived in India, and when I lived in India, I was actually there trying to take your jobs and offshore them and steal them from you so that you would be unemployed. Not exactly true, but I started a software development center in India, and I really was trying to pull work to India. And I was trying to make that kind of offshore model work. I learned a lot of things while I was there. I wrote a book about the experience, not just of being in India, but of what I think that teaches us as software developers in the United States and Western Europe, about how we need to behave if we want to remain relevant in the industry. So those are sort of the two perspectives that I'm coming with tonight. Ruby community, and then programmers as individuals staying relevant here in the United States. So, from the community perspective, and actually from both perspectives, Greg Brown said it earlier that we're at this special place. Things are changing rapidly in the Ruby world. They already have changed rapidly. They continue to change rapidly. The overquoted Gandhi reference that comes to mind is, you could probably recite it with me because it's so overused, especially in communities like this. I have to always read it so I don't get it wrong. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. People love to hear that whenever they're thinking of their own special little cause, you know. The Linux community uses it, the open source free software world uses it, the Perl communities used it. At OSCON 2005, which was kind of like an industry coming out party or coming of age party for Ruby, someone in a keynote actually said, you know, they use this like everyone does in those sorts of conferences, and then they say, except Ruby just skipped from the first step to the last step, and everyone laughed and applauded and everything else. So, to me, the interesting question now, you know, if people are perceiving us as having won, is they ignore you, they laugh at you, they fight you, and then you win, then what? So that's where we are right now. We've won. So now what do we do? Well, the first thing we need to really ask is, what does winning mean? I'm going to go back a little bit in time to 2001, October 11th, 2001, as a matter of fact. A month after September 11th, when we had the first International Ruby Conference. Dave Thomas gave the opening talk at the first International Ruby Conference. And he said something that was really impactful for the people there. He said, all of you, all 40 of you, or 39, or whatever we had at the first International Ruby Conference, all of you are pioneers because we're here. Not only just in Ruby, but in the whole dynamic language movement. And the fact that you all believe that there's something better. You're all pioneers. That's actually still kind of true today. You know, if you look at our numbers versus the J2EE world, many of them don't go to conferences unless their work makes them, of course, because they're not interested in it. But there are a lot of them. We still are sort of pioneers. The International Ruby Conference had 39-ish people, maybe it was 40, I can't remember. They were from sort of all over the globe. I think about half of them had written books that I had read and enjoyed in the last 6 months before the conference. There was 39 people. No one was interested in sponsoring that conference. You know, so I was telling Pat, it's amazing for this Mountain West Ruby Conference. Because of sort of the timing, and of course the efforts of the team here, they have, I don't know, 5 times the sponsorship that RubyConf has ever had. And the real International Ruby Conference is the one that Max comes to and sort of makes big announcements. It's because things are continuing to progress even since October of last year. That's amazing. The first conference, we had 40 people for the International Ruby Conference. And here we are with over 3 times that number of people at a regional thing. You know, that's great. That's sort of what winning is, right? Winning is also this kind of feeling that you get. You know, we're not really measuring it because you can't do things like measure Ruby adoption and really get a real number. We have things like the TIOE index and that sort of stuff to give us some indicators. But all the indicators say that unlike before, we're winning. We're getting mention in the press, you know, we're getting jobs. Like in 2001, nobody was doing Ruby professionally except for Max. I was the only person in the room at the International Ruby Conference. All the way through 2004, there was maybe 2 people who were doing Ruby professionally that were at that conference. Then all of a sudden, 2005, it was 50% of a room of 200 people. So of course something happened between 2004 and 2005, right? We're winning because of a specific framework. A specific, and not just the framework, but the marketing and all the other stuff that kind of came around the framework, which is brilliant. Didn't really need to tell you that, of course. So, yeah, we're winning. We're not really winning the industry, you know. What does winning mean? To me, winning means I don't have to go to work every day in the day job and do my Java stuff or my C stuff or whatever it is, and then go home at night and do things in Ruby. And wish every day that I was doing stuff in Ruby, and complain to my coworkers who think I'm crazy that I have to do this stuff in Java. It would be so much cooler in Ruby. Now I can just do Ruby stuff all the time. So that's kind of winning. It's winning that, say, Sun, Microsoft, companies like that are starting to get in the game. They're hiring people to work on Ruby, to really think about Ruby. The funny thing about that, though, is as soon as they do it, we start whining about it, you know. So in 2002, we were thinking, man, if we could just get Sun or Microsoft or someone to be interested to help us drive this thing, the industry would see it. Now Microsoft is doing something with Ruby, or it would be cool if they were doing something with Ruby, I should say. And we know they're doing something with Ruby, right? So some idiot walked by earlier today. I don't know if someone said this on the mic yet, but no, I don't know. I was told this story, but some idiot walks by the desk. I'm sorry, idiots, you're in here now. But they walked by the desk and they said, ooh, cool, a Ruby conference. I didn't know about this. Maybe I should come in. I'm doing Ruby at work and everything. You know, and they looked at the program and they saw the word Microsoft on the program. And they said, well, I'm not going in if Microsoft's involved in this. They're going to ruin it. Well, that's just moronic. There's no real point to be saying. That's just moronic. There is a point. Microsoft being involved means to some extent that we've won as well. Back in 2002, a bunch of us that were involved in the community tried to contact ActiveState and get them to do something with Ruby. Everyone thought that it would be great if they would do like Active Ruby like they did Active Perl, big success in the Windows community. We couldn't get them to do anything with Ruby. So clearly, there was a desire for this kind of stuff to happen, and now it's happening. You know, you have the no fluff stuff who are going around the country evangelizing Ruby to Java developers, even though that's not really its agenda. That's what's happening. People are demoing, installing Ruby apps and J2EE containers. Wonderful stuff. So we can start doing Ruby whenever we like at our jobs. So when, the word when, means something kind of dangerous. And of course, we're still sort of in that fighting mode, you know, so it's not like we're laying back and relaxing and saying, okay, we've won. But probably some of us are. The word win implies that the game is over. And that's the really dangerous thing. That's dangerous for us as both a culture and a community and as individual software developers. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is how that's dangerous and some ways that I think we should combat the dangers that come along with having one. Now, as I said, I don't really have a kind of a solution to these problems. What I'm really doing is I'm standing here telling you that I'm afraid, and I'm hoping that you can kind of help, you know. And I'm going to give you what my perspective is on how we should move forward. So, we'll start with the community. Now, the biggest thing that comes to mind when I think about the Ruby community and the danger of where it stands right now is, for so long, we've been a niche player. We've been fighting to be perceived as relevant, much less actually adopted and sort of put into a situation where people like us can sit and happily program Ruby productively during the day and experience that joy. So, when you spend all this time just fighting and fighting and fighting, the fear that I have, and that has sort of been realized in other communities over time, is that when you're in the mode of fighting all the time, arguing all the time, defending yourself all the time, what comes out of that is that when you actually gain some traction and some success, your community culture is to continue to fight and fight and fight, to continue to defend. So you go from being pioneers, as Dave Thomas said. We probably all think of ourselves now, right, as slightly smarter than the rest of the industry. Like by the very fact that you're here today, you think about your coworkers who didn't have the foresight to come to this conference or to, you know, participate in the kind of stuff that you're doing. Like, you know what a closure is. And those Uber Java programs at the office wouldn't have any idea why that's happening, you know. So, you pride yourself, and the community prides itself on being a community of experts and pioneers and forward thinkers. But if you continue to fight and fight and fight, then what you'll end up doing is turning what used to be a very forward-thinking, change-friendly environment into an established, rigid, dogmatic institution. Because the arguments, you know, I've been here for a while, and the arguments have remained very, very similar. Since the year 2000, when we were talking about why you should use Ruby, we say sort of the same things now. And what's really telling is not only do we say them, but the people people who started using Ruby as converts from C# or PHP or Java last year are saying the exact same things that we said in 2000. So what that tells me is that not only do we kind of have this preoccupation with fighting, we've built it into our culture, but we view argument and discourse as an act of war. Which means we close our ears, we close our minds as we discuss alternatives. And we'll talk in more detail about what that means. So the first step, I think, is if you're kind of that mindset, and I am, it's sort of unconscious now, you have to stop thinking in terms of defending yourselves. Dave Thomas did a keynote at RailsConf Europe. It's available online now. If you Google for it, it's on Google Video, where he talked about FUD, and he basically compared the software industry's tactics toward thwarting progress to that of terrorists. And basically that's where we are right now. We're reacting to terrorism in our industry. So the terrorism is it won't scale, or it hasn't been proven, or all the other kind of crap that you can't prove. But we're in this anti-FUD thing. We back up, though, the anti-FUD with, say, if FUD is fear, uncertainty, and doubt, then we back it up with bravo, certainty, and confidence, Which means it doesn't have a nice, an acronym that you can pronounce, unfortunately, like FUD. I'll like some suggestions for something pronounceable. But what it means is that we have patterns. Just like we sort of make fun of what does it scale, what people ask. Arrow showed us that it scales, of course. We make fun of that kind of stuff, but we have our own responses to those questions, which are sort of just as dogmatic and just as pre-programmed. So, for example, does it scale? Does Ruby perform well? Well, the answer is sort of no, not really if you compare it to Java or just C# running on the CLI. It really doesn't perform well. But, what is the answer? What do you say next after the but? What? Someone has an answer. But it doesn't matter. But it's fast enough. But it's fast enough.
We don't care.
We don't care.
Add more boxes.
Add more boxes. And then there's one sort of, to me, more poignant thing we say, which is you spend less development time because machines can scale. Programmers can't. They haven't really in the last however many years. They haven't really, the rate of productivity, so we lie to everyone and ourselves, hasn't really changed very much over the years. So using a tool like Ruby is a good trade-off because CPU cycles are cheap and programmers aren't. But we say that so many times, the first time you say that, or you hear it, first time you hear it, you think, oh, that's clever. And it just sounds right. It sounds right in the same way that, but does it scale? You don't know if it scales, sounds bad. It's also not provable in the same way that does it scale is not provable when you're having an abstract conversation. So we come up with all these little things about whether or not Ruby, how we respond to the FUD. We have all of these little platitudes that we repeat in conversations. And the first time you hear it, it sounds clever. The first time you say it, you feel clever because you thwarted a conversation from taking place. But there are a bunch of things that are really wrong with Ruby. And the first person to tell you about them will be Max, who makes Ruby, For example, Ruby 2.0. It's not out yet. We all know that. How about Perl 6? Ha ha ha. But Max was talking at RubyConf about the fact that Ruby 2.0 is actually vaporware worse than Perl 6. Because it was announced before Perl 6 was announced. You start reading the net about when, like the new Ruby virtual machine started to be talked about versus Parrot, for example. Ruby 2 is a bigger joke in terms of how long it's taken. It's not quite Newton forever yet. But, that's sort of sad. We still don't really know. They've at least started to say dates. Another one is, in the year 2001 at the International Ruby Conference, during Matt's keynote, he was talking about how Ruby 2.0 And when that might come out, we were all sort of excited about the next version of Ruby, which would be Ruby 2.0 with all these new features, selector namespaces, etc. But he asked us the question, he said, I'm working on multilingualization and internationalization support for Ruby 1.8. So I've got all this other stuff I want to do, but a show of hands, who would like me to just go ahead and delay the multilingualization and internationalization stuff so that I can go ahead and get 1.8 out with these new features? Because once we get 1.8 out, that's the stable branch, then we move on to 2.0. So, you're in the United States of America, Max, and you say, who wants to delay worrying about the rest of the world's languages? And, everybody raises their hand. Please give us some cool code. We don't care about internationalization. Fast forward 6 years, and we still don't care about internationalization. Until now, when the world outside of Japan has stopped or has started to use Ruby, then internationalization becomes a problem that we begrudgingly deal with. At this point, there actually isn't a good way to begrudgingly deal with internationalization. Is there some sort of platitude that we can give in response? David Hansen would say, it cramps our style, it's not a technical problem. And I say he would say that, meaning he did say that in public on the web, on Ruby for you to download and watch. But no, there aren't really any platitudes that sort of beat that. So the performance of Ruby is bad. We know that the performance of Ruby is bad. And there are people stepping up to fix that problem. Yarov, which is the official Ruby VM, and all these guys that were in the implementer summit. That's the sort of thing that we need to have happen. Talk about the warts. It has warts. We've won. We don't need to keep covering them up. The answer now to what does it scale is sometimes no, it doesn't. Does it do internationalization well? No, it's atrocious. Not just no, but it's horrible. We need to start uncovering this stuff. The winning thing that we've done, just on sort of a parallel to offshoring, we have one which, kind of in a funny way, it has not created more jobs. Paul Graham, I don't remember the exact quote, but Paul Graham said in an essay about 1.5 years ago, why would I do offshoring when I could just hire someone to do Ruby programming instead? So I don't need to offshore my team. I can get the same benefits by having one programmer instead of 10, but give them Ruby instead of Java or whatever Paul likes to make fun of. So we've actually sort of taken jobs away by doing this Ruby thing. And the more we win, the more we take jobs away. That's both a kind of a blessing and a curse. So the curse, of course, is there are less jobs here. The blessing is that the people who shouldn't have been doing them aren't doing them. And that's also true with offshoring. Because the truth is, I was there offshoring jobs. The truth is that if you can offshore a job, then it wasn't a job that any of us would consider to be worth doing in the United States anyway. And of course, that's a rash generalization. But I think offshoring jobs is a great thing to do. Because if you try to offshore the wrong job, which is one that is like a really valuable thing that you and I would actually want to do, it's just going to bounce right back. If you try to offshore the right job and it sticks, why did you do it anyway? Because offshoring is really, really hard. If it's that hard, why are you concerned with sticking with a job that can still be done with that kind of very coarse-grained resolution and low bandwidth? So anyway, kind of off topic there. One of the most fascinating things about the Ruby community today, I'm going to be hopping around, and you can actually interrupt me if you like. It says Keynote or whatever, but I'm just up here babbling, so please do interject if you want. The Ruby community today, kind of unlike the way it was back in 2000, is a very extreme melting pot and mesh of language communities. And the most obvious way is you have the Rails community and the Ruby community. And what does the Rails community mean? Well, from one perspective, it means the people who have started doing Ruby stuff because of Rails. A lot of them don't know that Ruby is a different language than Rails, partially due to the fact that Rails was so poorly named. It should be called Rails on Ruby, not Ruby on Rails, but maybe that was just a problem with translation. But we have this sort of melting pot of communities. We have people coming in from PHP, from .NET, ASP programmers, J2E programmers, and then of course, strange things like fourth dimension stuff that most of you wouldn't have ever heard of and are lucky if you haven't. But you have these people coming in with these different backgrounds that are just wildly varied. We also have the entrenched kind of free software foundation sort of people. You have system administrators, the intersection of those two. You have the agile community, who are also kind of they're actually farther into this, but they're in the boat where they started as a fringe niche thing, and they gained a lot of acceptance, and now they're, for the most part, just a bunch of crazy religious zealots babbling about their dogma. And that's us in a few years. That's what I'm saying here. So if you know any crazy XP people, that's us in a few years. So these people came in from all these other communities, and the first reaction that a lot of us Rubyists had was, oh yeah, like at the first International Ruby Conference, we had 40 people, and we were talking about language implementation. We had David Simmons, who was working on small script at the time, which I think is S# that still exists. But this guy was just a badass. He was a VM language implementing badass. It was all people like that. That was setting the tone of the conference and of the community. Speaking of the XP community, we had, 4, 5, 6, I think, signatories of the Agile Manifesto at the first Ruby conference. So you start adding these things up, and what you have is like a whole bunch of really smart people. The guy who made Seaside, which is a really innovative Smalltalk-based web framework. All these really, really smart people and me at this conference. And so, I was really kind of happy in that environment. And then these PHP people started leaking in because of Rails. And I was thinking, yeah, these people aren't that smart. ASP people, how could they do that for a living, I mean, it's okay that they're changing now. How is that okay for a year or whatever before they came to Ruby? And they're going to be just creating all kinds of nasty code. And they did. Like this guy named David Heimeyer Hansen had this horrible Ruby style. He created this thing called Insticky, which was a wiki, that no one would care about because there were already way too many wikis in the world. Of course, it was the most popular Ruby application ever. And then he created an MVC framework for Ruby when there were already way too many MVC frameworks. So, we're all thinking, yeah, even your ugly code, create your MVC framework, no one's going to care, that's all right. This is cute though. Grow up. But just don't code like that anymore. Someone's got to teach it, stop doing it. But now today I notice on everyone's slides, the style of their Ruby code looks like David Heimeyer Hansen's Ruby code. And the style of my Ruby code actually kind of looks like his Ruby code too. Through a filter of people like Jeremy Kemper and James Buck and Marcel, people like that. The grown-ups in Rails Core. I haven't signed a release for this video. So, the terrifying thing about this melting pot, because a melting pot, we're grown up to believe is not a good thing. And it really is. I'm talking about a couple of examples where I'm talking about really one example, where someone came in with these other ideas and this different perspective on how Ruby should look, and it made a very important big impact. But the natural tendency in a community like this, as it grows, is to take the community and run it like a big company bureaucracy. So, we're at RubyConf 2006, no offense, guys, but we start talking about having like a committee for the language spec and that kind of stuff. Yeah, these seem to be necessary things, and they probably are, but at the same time, they also resemble what happens in a corporation, And I work for very big corporations, I'm very used to the kind of corporate mentality. So you form committees and you have meetings, and eventually you create sort of a community culture that's unspoken. So you accept people from the outside, and then you run them through your cleanser, and eventually they act like you. And all these machinations that I'm talking about in sort of big corporations are geared toward doing this. I don't know who said it, but it's almost like the corporate antibodies attacking germs as they come in. So now that we have this big, solid, successful Ruby community, the antibodies are going to come in, the germs are going to start coming in. The germs like young PHP programmers with bad ideas. And we're going to start smashing them out. And that's a very big risk. If you read the Ruby Talk mailing list, you'll see that we've been doing this for years. So it's nothing new. In fact, if you Google for like static typing and Chad Fowler and Ruby Talk, you'll find many posts where I very passive-aggressively make people feel bad and try to expel them from the Ruby community for suggesting that we support static typing on method parameters. But if you look for the very first post that matches that, you'll see that I suggested we support static typing on method parameters. And someone like, say, David Allen Black, no, it was Guy Decoux, in his very French way, let me know that that was not a very good idea if I wanted to continue to have something called Ruby. So there are actually some germs in the community that do need to be cleansed. So we need to figure out what those are. You can also see those, and there are some that just won't go away. This germ idea actually came from Dave Thomas. I won't tell you exactly what we were talking about because it will make him seem mean. He really isn't. I'm the mean one. But I was talking to him on the phone one day about this repeated Ruby Talk offender who is like borderline troll, but never does anything quite trolly enough that you could call him a troll, you know? But always creates a flame war with a thread. And what Dave said was very wise. He said that these are the germs that you must be exposed to keep the community's antibodies strong. So there is a big trait, you know? If you're not used to having to defend your ecosystem, then maybe you won't know how to do it. And there is a real risk with the historic perception of the Ruby community being so nice. I've actually heard explanations for the continued existence of people like this on Ruby Talk that say that we are just too nice to them. We should just be mean or whatever. Because we're so nice, we do need to have these antibodies in place. So the question is, do we do it on new, potentially valid ideas, or do we do it on, bad ideas? And of course, we have to be very discriminating as we try to decide which is which. My suggestion is that we probably aren't very discriminating right now. We probably have sort of a switch, like, okay, that matches the pattern of all the things that have always gone into the bad idea bucket. We need to start turning that off. But they're not all necessarily bad ideas. For example, now I'm going to go on record and I'm going to say that we should have optional static typing in Ruby. Optional static method parameter typing in Ruby. Evan is cringing.
I want to hear the use case.
I don't have one.
You can't get it.
But I just think
8 by 11, 3 use cases, turn it in.
No. Okay, I don't actually believe we should have optional static typing in Ruby anyway. I don't like it. Yes, I do. No, I do. Yes. No. The point here is that what I just said was a total heresy in my book, and hopefully in yours too. That was the kind of thing that just goes against, actually I shouldn't have said optional, right? We should just have static typing. That goes against, what's that?
Now I'm cringing.
Oh, I thought you were going to say now you're buying into it.
Yeah.
I think this is actually what Rabinius is all about in the end. He wants us all to support him and like help work on the code, and he's going to add static typing. Anyway, so this is a heresy, right? Nobody in the right mind would think that's a good idea, because that's like, okay, grab Ruby's essence, remove it, and then here you can use this thing that's left over, the shell of language that's left over. So My point isn't really that we should have static typing in Ruby, obviously. But my point is there are some heresies that we should start to inspect. And this is also true of yourselves, but as a company, for example, a company has the same sorts of core beliefs. And sometimes those core beliefs are wrong. For example, IBM in the 80s. IBM in the 80s had a core belief that all the money in the future of computing and everything serious was going to happen on mini computers and mainframes. That was a core belief and the sort of thing that you wouldn't say like, well, what if we just, started focusing on these toy things that sit on people's desks? That was ridiculous. Nobody would do that, But then along came the PC. And the PC even got some traction because this was a heresy, and so obviously stupid and wrong, IBM didn't act on this. So the end result was Microsoft. Well, of course, Microsoft already existed. This was really the coming out. This was the great event where Microsoft became the IBM. And people at that time thought of IBM as the old, stupid, horrible thing, the old guard, the way people view Microsoft now, actually. But IBM just completely missed an opportunity because of this heresy that they refused to commit. The same goes for, say, Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble didn't think that online book sales would work. And they certainly didn't think that a nobody could come along, in this internet boom and make a site and almost put them out of business. But that's what happened with Amazon. So, I think it was Gary Hamel in Leading the Revolution, which is an excellent book for programmers. It has nothing about programming. Leading the Revolution is a business book about non-linear innovation. Gary Hamel suggests that all companies, as a practice, should set aside time on a regular basis to talk about these core values that they have and to question them and to break them down and try to sort of force fit the opposite of what you've always believed to be true. So one of those in Ruby, of course, is static typing, but there are a bunch of them. As a community, we should start to embrace the heresies. Matt's suggestion for that is, we do this byte shed thing. Now, of course, this is just the core language of the VM. But Matt's talked about at RubyConf 2006, byte shed arguments, where everyone can talk about the color of byte shed and have an opinion about that because it's so easy to have an opinion. We have those all over the Ruby community all the time. So Matt says, let's just encourage those, which was a really interesting perspective because most of us who are on, say, Ruby or try to watch RC Archive get very, very frustrated when yet another stupid idea about AOP and Ruby or something comes up, Yes, you're smiling, I see you. But Matt's response was, this is actually good. So, he gets it. The language does need to be exposed to this, but let's just encourage this and put together a process to make it happen really, really rapidly. So, the key here is that Ruby hasn't changed much in a long time. The community hasn't changed much in a long time. And if you think about, say, the way languages work, the way I speak English, regardless of how you feel about it now, 100 years ago, people would have thought that I was completely unintelligible and sounded like an idiot. But languages change via evolution. And we try to resist those changes. There are probably things that people say that all of you who are over, say, 25 don't like right now and you think are a degradation of the English language. But linguists know that languages evolve because small changes are introduced over time. And those small changes are in the sake of usually, one of two things. One thing is adapting to cultural stereotypes that are seen as being advantageous or prestigious. So you say things that make you sound smarter, or that make you sound more rich, or more hip, or whatever it happens to be, that increase your social status. But the other one that's probably more important for us in the Ruby community is that spoken languages, evolve to compress important thoughts into smaller and easier, more succinct ways of being expressed. So sometimes that's just the way we pronounce things. You know, in the United States, I don't say ta when I'm saying T in many cases. But, you know, sometimes it's actually words getting squished or removed or whatever it happens to be. Natural languages have a built-in mechanism for evolution. And that's the very fact that people speak them, and as long as two people can understand each other, the language can change. So, you know, they change region. And they change to express things that are important to the region that people live in. In Ruby, we don't have that sort of luxury. You know, we don't have it in really any kind of programming language. So, building in some kind of mechanism to accept change, not just in big design up front kind of ways, but in small evolutionary steps is really important. That's true for both the language and for the libraries. So, I was telling someone a couple of nights ago about Tibetan. Tibetan is a lovely spoken language. It's easy to understand, it's easy to learn. Kind of very logical rules that you can pick out. They didn't have a writing system. So, when Buddhism came to Tibet, the king of Tibet decided that they needed to have a writing system so that people could read the scriptures of Buddhism. So he recruited a bunch of scholars and sent them to India, where Buddhism came from, and they constructed a writing system. And it's really kind of a wonderful writing system in that it's beautiful, it's aesthetically pleasing, but it's also completely unambiguous. So in the Tibetan writing system, even though two words might be pronounced the same way, the people who designed the writing system said, well, let's not have any of that ambiguity. Let's actually just like stack letters and have different combinations. So what they created was a beautiful, well-engineered writing system that is almost impossible to learn, other than just to read. And because writing systems have a harder time evolving, the Tibetan writing system is actually sort of dying a faster death than the Tibetan spoken language. Because Tibetans who are displaced, you know, they learn the spoken language very easily through speaking to others, say, children in their orphanages, but there are very few people who are qualified to teach the writing system, and it's just not, you know, it hasn't evolved. So why am I talking about this? Things that are built in ivory towers like this, that are designed like this, don't evolve very well. Whether it be the language of Rudy, but we sort of have a mechanism in place for that, or the libraries, or the community. We have to be open to small evolutionary changes. So, I'm going to gauge myself on time here a little bit. I say 6:45, right? That's what we said. 6:30, 6:45. Okay, cool.
Hey, Chad,
Yeah.
can I ask you a question?
Yes, you can ask me a question.
So, on that language topic, so would you consider something that was totally engineered, say, an Esperanto, in that same category?
Totally. Yeah.
And so, therefore, would you consider, therefore, that a forced evolution by a scholarly body, for the most part, a bad thing?
In general, although it sounds like I'm being set up.
No.
Note my ambiguous answer.
No, I was just thinking about Pearl 6, actually, given its time frame and forced evolution along those same lines.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we can't really say that that's why Pearl 6.
No, absolutely.
But it feels like it.
Because, I mean, they didn't say that about Esperanto either. They thought this is going to be awesome.
Right.
I mean, it may not go that way.
Or Load
Right. But in that same vein.
Yeah, that's a very good example. Pearl 6, you know, it's not like we've done a bunch of research and we know that Pearl 6 was stalled for that reason. Of course, we can make fun of Ruby 2 and say that it was stalled just the same way.
Sure.
But, you know, there also is that sort of anxiety to change and anxiety to make a big release, evolutionary steps to get there faster. Another pet peeve of mine, to take a very quick diversion, is the addition of things to the Ruby standard library. That's another way that you lock something down. You put an RSS library, and this is going to sound like I'm whining because I have some crappy RSS library too, but mine is not as good as the one in Ruby. I'll go on record. You put an RSS library in, and it just stagnates there in Ruby core. And no one writes their own. I mean, other people have, but in general, you don't feel the need to write an RSS library that's already there. So I think we should just hollow out Ruby core as well. Get rid of everything. Make it all gems, actually. Gems is the one thing that should be there, If you don't like it, it helps to make it better. Because that helps you get stuff, But you get that sort of evolutionary growth of the standard library as well. So anyway, sort of change the rhythm here. I think probably the number one risk that we have in terms of having one as a community, one, whatever war it was we were in, whatever fight we were fighting, is that now Ruby is a web development language. Yeah. Who wants to do web development? Not me. And we know it's not a web development language, but it gets shelved in web development sometimes in the bookstores. And people talk about it as a web development language. So it's sort of being lumped in as PHP, or as another PHP, or PHP replacement. None of us would like to be identified that way, right? That we focus all of our energy on something that's like PHP, I don't think. So, but because we sort of won, it would be really easy to just stop here and let it be a web development language. I mean, I've been in the community for a long time, and I've been obviously pretty active trying to advocate Ruby, given that I'm in Ruby Central, which is an organization to support Ruby. And what I've done is I've said, oh, Rails, great, thank you. I've wanted to program in Ruby for a long time. Now I do Rails stuff for a living. So now I'm comfortable. Now I feel like, great, I can do Rails stuff. I'm sort of done. I've won that fight. I'm doing Ruby all day. The fear that I have is that that's where we stop, because people like me stop there. And it's not like I'm the most important person, but there are a bunch of us. There are a bunch of us who might have been the one that created the other killer app. So we need to start thinking about the real killer app for Ruby. If you think about it, Rails has a very small market share. It has upset a lot of people and probably changed the course of the industry in terms of web development 10% or something. It's changed the direction of it. But it's also opened the door for letting weird languages in. So we have this opportunity now to say, let's build the real killer app for Ruby. Era was talking about we need to be able to distribute apps written in Ruby. People aren't really running Ruby developed applications on their machines. And that's still the majority of where business is done, computer use is done. There's something left to be done. I don't know what it is at all. Web development is not a very interesting problem to solve, especially with an MVC framework. It's kind of like, we have an MVC framework. So, if you're working on trying to grow as a community, building another Rails is a complete waste of time. Absolute waste of time. Building a Rails clone or anything like Rails, I'll almost go so far as to say any web application development framework for fear of offending people. I'll qualify that by saying, unless it's sufficiently different, where you have to think differently, and it really creates a completely different sort of mindset. So, Iowa has existed for a long time. That's nothing like Rails. Nitro, on the other hand, exactly like Rails. So I don't know. As a community, we're not very well served continuing down that path. When you look at what we've won, if you think of us as pioneers, what we have won as a community is, actually Dave Thomas gave me this kind of metaphor recently. We have won the ability to live in suburbia. So think back a few years at the cutting edge stuff that you might have been doing in Ruby if you were doing Ruby several years ago. You probably didn't think you were going to be making web applications in an MVC framework. But it's safe. You can make a nice salary. You can do Ruby and kind of be comfortable. It's just like suburbia in terms of pioneering. It's a nice place to stop. And the problem with it being such a nice place to stop is you might just get comfortable, buy a bigger house, buy some more cars, kind of get stuck there. And then you die with a pot belly. In case you're wondering, I'm chatting on IRC on my computer. Okay, Dave, what was it next? So, I am dangerously on the verge of running out of time. Unfortunately, I have no slides, so I don't have to skip through them. So, communities are built by individuals, of course. But the scary thing about our community, and really all communities, but our community right now, is individuals are also sort of created and formed by communities. When I say individual in this case, I mean the behavior of the individual, the belief system of the individual. So, Steven Pinker, who wrote The Language Instinct, he talks about how the difference between language and meaning. So, is language a way of expressing meaning, expressing thoughts? That's what most of us think, right? Steven Pinker, who is a linguist, argues that no, it's not. They're actually kind of combined. Not only that, but the languages we have available change the thoughts we think because we think in those languages, right? So, the same is true of the metaphors we use. I just happen to read all these sorts of pop science books, so I'll give you another one. It's called Metaphors We Live By George Lakoff and somebody else. That's probably not cite anything. Metaphors We Live By is a fascinating book that I've been reading recently, where basically they say, we have meaning, and we usually use metaphors to express those meanings. But it turns out that the meanings we have are actually also shaped by the metaphors that we use. So, for example, the first example in the book, and actually the most relevant here, is that argument is war. If you think about it, every time you ever talk about argument in any kind of descriptive way, you will probably unknowingly use war-related metaphors. You'll talk about defending a position and attacking a position and winning and losing and all this kind of really negative, hostile stuff. And it doesn't have to be true that in all cultures we have the metaphor of argument as war, but it is true that in ours we do, and we almost don't know that that's true. What that means is that because of these metaphors we have built in our heads, we think of argument as war, and when opposing views come, like I was talking about earlier, we feel like we have to defend them. We have to defend them ferociously. So, on top of this argument is war thing, you might also think that, say, communities and cultures are an artifact and a thing that we build around us as individuals to support us. But it actually turns out that, according to a book called Beyond Culture, all of these books very conveniently say what I want them to say. According to this book by Edward Hall called Beyond Culture, at this higher level, the cultures we build actually shape the way we can conceive of our own selves as individuals. The example there is the Industrial Revolution in England, as that started to happen. Before it happened, people were working in fields. People came in off the fields and they started working in factories. And they worked however many hours they had to have enough money, and then they went home. And that might mean they worked for a week and then they went home for a month, but whatever. So that sounds weird when you first hear it, because you're used to 9 to 5 or 7 to midnight or whatever it is you work. But back then, that was actually normal. That was a completely acceptable way of life, because there may be months that you went by and didn't really do a lot of work back then. You worked to live, whereas in our culture, we live to work. But what happened was, the culture, you have these people coming and doing this, their kids had to go somewhere at that time. So the kids also came to the factory. And that was okay too, Doesn't sound good now either, does it? But the kids came to the factory, they got used to hearing the bell. So there was the 9 to 5 thing, or whatever they worked in the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure it was a little worse than 9 to 5. And they got that sort of Darwinian response. So the culture of those kids became a culture of going to work, working for a while, and then going home. That was a nice one. The same thing, you could say, is happening in the Rudy community. And you can probably look at the other communities. The same thing is happening in, say, the Slashdot. Can you call that a community? It's certainly a culture, right? People, smart people, come into this geek culture that we've built. which is one of the worst things we could have ever done to ourselves as like a subgroup of this culture. You know, the computer programming or technical subgroup. If you want to keep your jobs, kill the geek culture. But the geek culture is all about being this grunting moron that sits in the back and has no social skills but does wonderful things that nobody understands on the computer. If nobody understands the things, then they're not wonderful, right? Software is built for businesses. It's built to make money. It's built to solve problems, to help people. And if you're just some asshole system administrator that acts like a jerk all the time and creates things that nobody understands, then that's what you are. You're an asshole system administrator. You're not providing value. The problem is geek culture says that that's good. You know, the Slashdot people, they celebrate that kind of thing. The Perl community celebrates that kind of thing. And the Linux community celebrates that kind of thing to some extent. And otherwise smart people come into these cultures and they're swayed by this. The Rails community celebrates, say, typing stuff. And otherwise smart people like myself come into the Rails community and we got caught up on this and we type things, you know? Sometimes that's good. I'm not saying that all of these are bad. But it's definitely true that we're shaped by the cultures we live in. So let's turn away from the communities for a very brief time to us as individuals. Because I think we have this sort of equally scary issue, and this is the one that scares me most because I'm selfish, like all of us. As a programmer, I've invested all this stuff in Ruby. And I have, even though I rationally know it's a bad thing, I have my identity wrapped up in being a Ruby programmer, or being a Ruby author, or speaker, or whatever it happens to be, you know. I tie myself to Ruby. When I do that, I tie myself to the community and all of the pitfalls that come with it. I remember actually talking to Avi Bryant, who was a former Ruby guy, who is now a Smalltalk programmer. He was showing me all this stuff on Smalltalk, and I was really liking it, and I said, you know, it's ridiculous, but I'm really kind of unhappy that you're doing this to me, because I like this. And what if I like it so much that I don't do Ruby anymore? I might be sad. And he said, you know, I feel exactly the same way about Smalltalk. It's weird, isn't it? Yeah, it's weird. But you know, that tells me I'm a pretty smart person. There's something baked in there that I'm maybe not controlling. Maybe it's some sort of, you know, of course it's a sense of self-identity. We like to connect ourselves with things that we feel are important. But that may cloud our judgment. It may create something that Robert Pirsig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is also a very important book for programmers, he calls value rigidity. Value rigidity is when you have values as an individual that are more important than your surrounding context. And so he has a wonderful example in his book, which I stole and put in my book, My John Went to India, where he talks about the South Indian monkey trap. So the thing with the South Indian monkey trap, I actually lived in South India, I never tried this, but now I wish I had. The monkeys in India are really, really annoying, and they're actually kind of terrifying too. They get really brave. They do things like run up and smack you and run away and snatch things from you. These disgusting little attacks that seem cute until you realize how many diseases they have. So the monkeys have to be controlled. And in South India, they came up with this really insightful way of controlling monkeys. And that was they would dig a long, slender hole in the ground. At the bottom of the hole, they would use an instrument to sort of widen the opening at the very bottom of the hole. And the hole was just long enough for the monkey's hand to go down, the monkey's arm. And at the bottom of the hole, they would put a bunch of rice or something the monkey wanted to eat. And they'd go and wait, right? So monkeys would come along and realize there was food in the hole, and reach their arm down into the hole, grab as much of that food as they could. Because food is what they're after. That's why they act like jerks, you know? Food is what they're after. They'll chase you and bite you and do anything they can to get it. They reach down and grab this rice or whatever it is, and they make as big a fist as they can, and then they pull, and they've got too big a fist and they can't get their hand out of the hole. So then the person that's tracking the monkey comes out with a club and walks up to the monkey, and the monkey is just sitting there grasping his food, trying to rip it from the hole, never will it let go of the food, because the monkey suffers from value rigidity. The value rigidity is, this food is important to me, even though someone's about to club me over the head. I can't let go of it. I fear, for one, that Rudy has become like the food in the hole for me. And, as I stand here today with the word Keynote on my badge, this may go to my head, and I may think, well, now I'm a Keynote in the Rudy community or something, and I may never want to leave it. So we have all these sort of things in our heads, and it's really easy to lose track of them, and to lose track of which ones are guiding our decisions. Most of us anyway in the industry, even the smart ones, just sort of float down the stream and go wherever the stream takes us. I interviewed people, hundreds of people, when I worked at large company that you've heard of. And at large company, those people would say, like I say, do you ever try, say, you're on a scheme as a programming language? And they'd say, no, I've never been given the opportunity to do that. What does that mean? But it turns out most people are like this. Unless you ask them to do something for work, give them a computer and say, go ahead and install it and do it, they're not going to do it. They're not given an opportunity. They're just floating down the stream. That's a ridiculous example, which unfortunately is true for many of the programmers that don't deserve to have jobs, but do. But those of us who try not to be like that also suffer from those kinds of autopilot decisions that we make throughout our careers. How did you end up here today? Was it through a series of circumstances that were coincidence, or did you build this path that you're on? I don't mean design it up front and know what you're going to be doing in 20 years, but did you take a step of, or a series of intentional steps to get where you are, or did you float along, or sort of done both? I don't know. I think that the problem continues to get more and more granular, and as I think that I've solved it for myself, I realize that just at some lower level or some hidden level, I'm still kind of just flowing down the stream of Rudy now. And it's really easy when you're proud of yourself for having picked the right thing, for being smart enough to be here. It's really easy to say, well, now it's good enough. I've done the right thing. I'm on the cutting edge. But that's what the J2EE people thought they were doing too. Now, they haven't lost yet, but they're very much at risk of being lost. And those of us that are here think of them as like being curmudgeons, slow to adopt, not getting it. So, introspection is very important from that perspective. And again, it's kind of like the heresies. What are the values that you hold so dearly that you're going to be rigid about them? So rigid that you can't even realize that you're making decisions based on them. So, the way I see it now as individuals, we have 3 possible courses of action out in the Rudy community for maintaining our relevancy in this industry. There's actually a 4th one. Okay, I'll tell you the 4th one first, and that's don't worry about it, quit, really not that important. And when I say really not that important, I mean, if you really spend all your time worrying about your job, then you're totally missing the point anyway. And maybe you should be a film director or work at Barnes & Noble or something like that. I'm not joking about that. That should be something you consider. But the 3 things, if you're kind of going to continue down this, I want to be a great programmer path that you're hopefully on. One is that you can look at this community and this Rudy world that you're in and try to lead in some way. Now, if you want to be successful, leading means leading the community. It means setting up this conference or speaking at this conference or creating a new project and driving it forward or doing the documentation project or the Ruby test project, something that people don't even want to do. And that's kind of what I've made a career out of doing in Ruby. I was talking to someone a couple of days ago, about the fact that a couple of years ago people started talking about me being famous, like on webinars, in the Ruby world, which I thought was ridiculous. Because some of the people who were saying it were just so much cooler than I was, better programmers and everything else. And I realized, as I think about this a lot, what drives popularity, what has created fame for me has really just been doing things like organizing conferences and doing stuff that doesn't require any computer savvy at all, except using Excel or whatever. So I've basically been like a glorified secretary for the Ruby community, and that has worked out very well for me. This person who I was talking to said, yeah, but you also work on Ruby gems, and that's really important too. But I look at that, and my role in Ruby gems was largely helping to make it popular. I wrote some of the code too, but the largest contributions I've made are about leadership in the community. Now, of course, not everybody wants to do that. Most people want to do something cool. One option is to, write the next killer app, the thing that makes everybody forget about what Rails was, or the thing that's, so much more ubiquitous than that. And it's not because we want to think badly of Rails. Rails has helped us all as Ruby programmers. And to poo-poo it right now is really lame. And if you do that, and you consider yourself a Ruby programmer, you should be ashamed of yourself. But Rails is not the be-all, end-all of what can happen with Ruby, so work on it. Some of that might be working on the VM implementations, because that's going to not only, help bridge, or help create a bridge for hundreds of thousands of Java programmers to come into the community, for example, but it's also going to help Max and Goichi. In fact, today they hosted an interview, James Edward Gray hosted an interview with them, where they talked about how much they value the contributions of, say, Rubinius and JRuby because it's teaching them things. It's making Ruby better. So, innovate. Now, the one that's most exciting to me is diversifying. If you've read The Pragmatic Programmer, how many have read The Pragmatic Programmer? Yeah. I'm not affiliated with them other than they publish my book, but I don't work for them or anything. It really is a book that everyone should read. What they talk about is building your knowledge portfolio. So what I'm doing now is I'm really just kind of regurgitating what I learned from them 7 years ago. And that is, now is the time to really start thinking about diversifying, because probably until now Ruby was the diversification of your portfolio. Now Ruby is mainstream. Now it's the boring thing you do. So for me, what does diversification mean? Well, it's probably Erlang or Haskell or something that changes the way I think about programming. Maybe Campbell. Another possibility, say, Giles Boquet, who's not here unfortunately, I saw a really interesting post on his weblog recently where he said, essentially, last year I did Java during the day, wished I was doing Ruby, and did Ruby at night. Now I do Ruby during the day, I've got a job, and I do Seaside and Smalltalk at night. And I think that's the meme that we want to start seeing more and more and more. Because if you look back at the Java world, and I use that, I make fun of Java and I talk about Java because that's where I come from, so it's okay. It's the whole you make fun of your own mother thing. No, I can't do that either. People from the Java world got better and better and better when they started doing that. Because before Java was what, C++ or C or something, Java was a step forward and moved everyone, as they say, closer to Lisp, which is where we are all headed, So it's a step forward closer to Lisp. Ruby, of course, is another good step forward, and it changed the way people program in Java for the better. So it's not that you have to just leap from that language, but now that we're in Ruby, if we start doing things like actively diversifying, pushing forward, and going into things that change the way we think, whether they be Smalltalk, Haskell, Erlang, something I've never heard of, now is the time to start doing it. If you have a Ruby job, then now is the time to start learning the new language that totally freaks you out. Because where do you want to be on a daily basis? You want to focus on on not knowing things. You're not on a quest for knowing, right? You should always be pushing toward not knowing. You want to be in that comfortable space. You want to push toward always being uncertain. Because if you don't know the answers and you're always uncertain, you know that you're growing. And at this point, a lot of you know the answers and you feel very comfortable and very certain when you're doing Ruby programming. And if that's true, you're no longer growing. So keep pushing forward. Now, the best thing you can possibly do, of course, is all three. So lead in the community and innovate. You know, whether it's actually innovate or just help the people that are doing it, which is where I've been for my entire career at Ruby, and continue to diversify. There's no reason to really pick between those three things. That's the way to stay relevant and stay fresh, and to avoid getting trapped in this pit of Ruby that we all have kind of a danger of being trapped in right now. So I'm kind of out of time now, but the last thing that I want to say is, if you can remember the day, and for me this is harder than it is for a lot of you, but the day you saw Ruby for the first time, it really clicked, and it felt really cool and really exciting. Unless you were already a Lisp programmer, and then you go, good time to use something that's mainstream. But that day, Ruby for me, when I picked it up, it was like, I don't know, October of 2000, and I was trying to learn Smalltalk, and I decided to spend a day playing with Ruby. And as I was playing with it, it felt like really exotic. Exotic. It felt exotic, and it felt new, and it felt smart, and I felt like I was getting smarter as a result of using it, and it felt like magic. And I thought about it like when I woke up immediately the next morning. But I don't really think like that about Ruby today. I didn't wake up this morning and think, wow, that same sort of tingly feeling of excitement about Ruby. So I think what I'm going to do to challenge myself, and what I would say all of you should do to challenge yourselves, and to keep both yourselves and the community fresh, is to look for ways both inside and outside of Ruby to experience that same feeling as often as possible. Because that's how you know you're kind of going in the right direction, you're continuing to grow. Try to always experience that magic. Otherwise, Ruby will become the boring old thing that we all laugh at in 10 years. And we're talking about some language that doesn't yet exist. So, I don't know if I have time for questions, but that is, any questions? Or jeers or comments?
Yeah, what is your next language after Ruby? Which language is it?
My next language after Ruby? My next languages after Ruby are Erlang and Haskell. And the reason for those are Erlang makes you think very differently about, well, they both are functional languages, which is the one place where me and most of my posse are uncomfortable, right? So functional languages also have a very obvious application in our Ruby programming. So I want to change the way I think based on that, and then of course the highly distributed nature of Erlang is fascinating. Yeah.
What was the first book you mentioned before the Consumer Thinker one? Do you remember?
I think I probably have one on this somewhere.
Later.
Was it the metaphor related book? I'll see. Metaphors we live by?
Leading the Revolution.
Leading the Revolution? Leading the Revolution by Gary Hamel, H-A-M-E-L.
Hey, Chad.
Evan?
So I was writing down questions. So do you think that like a cult of personality in a community can be dangerous though?
Yeah, can a cult of personality in a community be dangerous? Sure.
Okay.
Definitely. And of course, we have a very obvious cult of personality, and we only have two, right? Here in our community, like I can say chunky bacon, and only the smart people will think I'm an idiot. The really smart people. Which, in a normal room full of people, everyone would think I was an idiot. I was babbling about something. So there's one. The other one, of course, is David Hansen. And it's, there's nothing negative about them being the cults of personality. But yeah, part of the dogma of the Ruby community comes from just sort of blindly following the things they say. And David is a really good example where he used mantras to get his message across. And his mantras were very intentionally constructed to do that, like marketing, right? Convention over configuration, all these sorts of things. We just believe that those are good. In the same way that I remember in year 2000 when EJB came out, there was a list of stuff that we would say about EJB. That's why you want to use it. None of us had actually proven to ourselves that that was good, but we believed in the vision and we were trying to push it forward. So a cult of personality like that gives us a very clear hook and a role model for blindly repeating things and spreading on.
Yeah, well, tying into that, and just a couple questions, I think that sometimes you do have to have a codification of these new ideas like convention over configuration. If they truly are new, sometimes you need them to be transmitted. You need the meme to be transmitted in a way that really catches on. And so I wouldn't necessarily denigrate what he did. But the other question, kind of totally unrelated, that I have, I'd like you to comment on is, when you say going home and working on Haskell, I mean, I love doing that stuff, but actually lately I felt like I got to go home and actually work on my family. You know what I mean? Like, and that's a huge challenge that I face, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts and your experiences on just how to that life balance kind of equation.
Okay, the first thing I want to say is you're absolutely right that what David did with his mantras and all that stuff was exactly right. And it's what got us to where we were. He was not afraid. He didn't have to hide behind some shell of, oh, I'm a geek, I don't have to be social. He came out and he did all this stuff. And we owe him big thanks because we wouldn't be here today doing this thing if he hadn't done all that stuff. So I'm not saying that was bad. I am saying we need to be aware of the environment that creates later on for us. Now the real question, and probably the best question that we'll get is, I was talking about going home and learning Haskell and all this stuff, And sure, that means you have to work at night doing stuff, but isn't it more important to work on your family? And that's sort of what I meant when I said maybe you should just be working at Barnes & Noble. And I don't mean you, but I mean like maybe I should just be working at Barnes & Noble. Because I've gotten to where I've gotten by not doing as good a job on working on the family as I should, by doing a lot of work on learning Haskell and that kind of stuff, So the fact that you even asked that question is a really good thing and a good sign for you. And, you shouldn't really even care what my answer is, in my opinion. If you feel that way, then screw what I have to say. Marty.
Chad, you have to sacrifice them. I have a very, very active family life, but yet I've done a lot of these same things. And it's just about prioritizing how you spend your time. Like once the family's asleep or whatnot, you should have some time for yourself, and you just do the things then, perhaps.
Yeah.
It is a challenge. But it is
Good
a
point.
challenge. It is a challenge. You have to make it a point that you aren't going to let the family do its own thing and ignore it while you code.
So Marty is saying you have to time box, prioritize, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, very good points. I think we're completely out of time now. It's time to eat. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to meet you all during breaks and all some dinner.